All right, good morning once again, church family. As you all find your seat, let me invite you to open your Bible or type into your device Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 36. Mark 14, 32 to 36. Title of the sermon this morning is Submitting to God's Will. We're going to be looking at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane this morning and how he submitted to his Father's will. So let's read the text, open us in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into our sermon this morning. Mark 14, beginning in verse 32. Here's what Mark writes. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." If you will, pray with me. Father, I pray this morning as we look at this very short prayer of Jesus, the first part of it, and God, would you teach us how we can learn to submit to your will, especially when we are going through a trial or when we're going through suffering or affliction. And every part of our soul is crying out saying, "God, remove this from me. I don't want to suffer anymore. I don't want to be in this trial anymore." Help us, God, to recognize that even if it is your will for us to continue in this trial, help us, God, to submit ourselves to you. Help us not to do things our way. Help us to have a heart that says, "Not my will, but yours be done, Lord." I pray this all in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. We are jumping right into the middle of a story this morning, and so let me give the context so to bring us all up to speed and where we know where we're at, and then I'll give exposition of the text, and then I'll give application. So here's the context. It is Thursday night of Passion Week. So Passion Week is the week before Jesus is crucified. It's Thursday night of Passion Week. The chief priests and the scribes have made plans to kill Jesus. A woman made plans to anoint Jesus. Judas has made plans to betray Jesus. And Jesus has made plans to have a meal with his disciples. There's a lot of plans going on here. And Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. After he does so, he goes out to the Mount of Olives with his disciples. And on the Mount of Olives, Jesus makes 4 prophecies that we looked at last week. The first one is that Judas will betray him. The second is that the disciples will abandon him. The third is that Peter will deny him. And the fourth is that Jesus will go before them. Those are the 4 prophecies that he gives. And now it is only a matter of hours. It's only a matter of hours before Jesus will die for the sins of the world. And here's the question. How is Jesus going to spend his last remaining hours on this earth? What is he going to do? How is he going to spend that time? That's what we're going to look at this morning. Let's start with the exposition of the text. We'll start in verse 32, taking it verse by verse, and then I'll give application for us. Mark 14:32, Mark writes, "They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.'" So Jesus now takes his disciples, and he goes to a place called Gethsemane. Now, John called in John's gospel, he calls it a garden. We often call it the Garden of Gethsemane. But it's really not a garden in the sense we think of a garden. It's an olive grove. It's actually an olive grove. The name Gethsemane means olive press. And so John says that Judas knew the place because Jesus would often meet there with his disciples. So this was a very popular place where Jesus would go with his disciples to maybe disciple them, to pray, to rest. And so Jesus takes them to this olive grove once again. Now on this occasion, why is he going there? Why is Jesus taking them to an olive grove on this night? He has one purpose: to pray. He tells his disciples, sit here while I pray. So Jesus has the 8 disciples sit there and wait. Look at verse 33. And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. So the 8 stay in one place, and Jesus takes with him 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John. Now these disciples are often called the inner 3. The reason they're called the inner 3 because they are the only 3 disciples to witness the transfiguration. Jesus takes them with him up the mountain. They are the only 3 disciples who witnessed Jesus raising a little girl from the dead. And they are the only 3 disciples who get to be with Jesus during this time of prayer, or at least intimately with Jesus during this time of prayer. Mark writes that Jesus begins to be greatly distressed and troubled. Here, once again, we see the humanity of Jesus. The word for distressed means to be moved to a relatively intense emotional state. So Jesus is feeling intense emotions right now. The word for troubled means to be distressed with the probable implication of anguish. So Jesus is feeling anguish. He's feeling intense emotions. Why? What is causing this distress? What is causing him to feel this anguish? We'll see in just a minute. Look at verse 34. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. So Jesus says to his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, he says, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. The word for sorrowful there means to be very sad, deeply grieved. Yes, Jesus got sad. Yes, Jesus was grieved. Jesus describes his sorrow as even to death. What does that mean? I think it means that whether it's meant to be literal or an idiom, he's saying his sorrow is so great, he could even die from this. That's how great his sorrow is. And Jesus gives his disciples 2 commands, 3 disciples, 2 commands. Here are the 2 commands. A, he says, remain here. Remain here. Now that's pretty straightforward, but I want you to consider that, interesting enough, the Greek word for remain here is the same word as abide in John 15. Same exact word as abide. B, he tells them to watch. Remain here and watch. Now watch for what? Watch for who? Normally if you tell somebody to watch, you telling them to watch out for something or someone. Is that what Jesus is doing? Is he telling them, watch out for soldiers, watch out for Judas, watch out for wolves, watch out? What is he telling them to watch out for? Jesus actually means it in a different sense here. The word Jesus uses for watch here, it's used 22 times in the New Testament. It is translated watch, stay awake, be alert. It is usually used in a spiritual sense, not in a physical sense. So Jesus is telling them, spiritually watch, spiritually stay awake, spiritually be alert. Look at verse 35. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. So Jesus now goes a little farther. Luke tells us that it was a stone's throw, which means it's not far. Now there are 3 groups. There are 8 disciples in one location. There are 3 disciples in another location. And then Jesus is by himself. Jesus falls on the ground and he prays. Now that's important because Jews in those days, they normally prayed standing up. They would pray standing up with their hands often with their hands lifted up like this. That was the normal posture for prayer. But in times of intense agony and anguish, they would fall on the ground. and pray. And that's what Jesus does. He falls on the ground and prays. Now, what did he pray? He prays, if it is possible, that the hour might pass from him. Just to clarify, the hour here is being used as a metonymy for his crucifixion and all that it implies. So he's not just praying like a little hour. He's praying that the hour, meaning as a metonymy, so everything that's going to happen over the next 12 to 24 hours, that all of this would pass, that he wouldn't experience all of the things that it entails. Now, this prayer of Jesus raises all kinds of questions, doesn't it? Number one, what does it mean if it were possible? He says, if it's possible. What does he mean if it's possible? Number two, why does Jesus pray this? Does this mean that Jesus didn't want to die? I was always taught growing up as a little kid that Jesus wanted to die for me. Does this mean that he didn't want to die? And number three, what would it mean if God actually answered this prayer? His son prayed, may the hour pass. What if God said, sure? What would that mean? Let's look at those really quickly. Number one, what does it mean if it is possible? What does that mean? Let's be clear what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean possible in the ability sense. We know this because in the very next verse, Jesus is going to affirm all things are possible for you. So it doesn't mean in the ability sense. So the question of, is God able to remove this cup? Is God able to do this? Yes. Yes, of course. All things are possible, including removing this cup. So what does Jesus mean? I think it means if it is possible according to your will. In other words, he's praying, if you are willing, if it is possible that you would will this, would you do it? I think that's what he's saying. Number two, why does Jesus pray this? Does this mean that Jesus didn't want to die? I think we have to remember the incarnation here. The incarnation is the teaching that Jesus was fully God and fully human. That's a mystery, but it's true nonetheless. Fully God, fully human. And so I think this is what the gospel's teaching us, that on his humanity side, think of it like this. Imagine if someone came to me and they said, Matt, you can go through suffering and die so that your children will live. Or you can choose not to, and they will die. And if somebody said, do you want to do this? Well, my first thought is, well, I don't want to suffer. I don't want to die. But I want my children to live more. So yes, I will suffer and die. So I think Jesus is speaking simply as a human here, saying like he doesn't want to suffer. He doesn't want to die in that sense. He doesn't want to in that sense. But there's something else going on here. On the divinity side, I don't think that Jesus' main prayer was about the physical pain. I don't think that when he's asking that this hour would pass, that he's thinking about the physical pain and he's praying, saying, God, would you please not have me experience this physical pain? I don't think that's his main prayer. I think verse 36 is a clue to that, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And number three, what would it mean if God answered this prayer? What would it mean if God said, sure, I'll let it pass? What would it mean if God did not allow his son to not go through the crucifixion? What would that mean? Well, we are dealing with theory here, okay? Make sure we hear that. We're dealing with theory here. But I see two possibilities in theory. A, everybody goes to hell. Jesus doesn't die on the cross. Everybody goes to hell. That's a real possibility. Or B, God finds another way. All things are possible. God finds another way. Those are just theoretical possibilities, though. They're not real possibilities. Look at verse 36. And he said, Abba, Father. All things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Now, Mark records Jesus' actual prayer. He prays, starting off with, Abba, Father. Abba, Father. What does that mean? Abba is the Aramaic term for father. It's only used 3 times in the New Testament. Now, this Aramaic term conveys intimacy, trust, and affection. Intimacy, trust, and affection. You see, the Jews called God Father. We see that in the Old Testament. They would address God as Father, those who had a relationship with him, but they did not call him Abba. Abba was a term that was used in the home. It was often used of even little children. They did not call God Abba, but here Jesus does. Here Jesus does. Jesus says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. In other words, Jesus does not doubt the sovereignty of his Father. He knows good and well that his Father is sovereign and he can do all things. And it is precisely because he believes that his Father can do all things that he prays this prayer. He makes a request. He says, Father, remove this cup from me. Remove this cup from me. Now, what does that mean? What does he mean? What is he praying when he says remove this cup? The hour passing from him and the removing of the cup, these are synonymous. Those are the same thing. The hour passing, removing the cup, they're the same thing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in this second statement, removing the cup, we are given a clue that what Jesus is asking to be spared from is not primarily physical pain. We're given a clue here. What is Jesus actually primarily asking to be spared from? The wrath of his Father. The wrath of his Father. How do we know this? Because in Psalm 11, Psalm 75, Isaiah 51, Jeremiah 25, Ezekiel 23, Revelation 14, Revelation 16, the cup refers to the outpouring of God's wrath. That's how the cup is used in Scripture. Jesus is greatly distressed. He is troubled. He is sorrowful at the thought of drinking the cup of his Father's wrath. And so he asks his Father, he says, Father, will you remove it? He says, can I not drink this? But look at what he says next. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Now that raises some questions too, doesn't it? Number one, does this mean that Jesus and the Father have 2 different wills? And number 2, does this mean that Jesus has a choice here? In other words, could Jesus have chosen not to die on the cross? Let's look at the first question. Does this mean that Jesus and the Father have 2 different wills? Well, again, we must remember that Jesus is fully human. And the question is, what does that mean to be a human? The early church wrestled with this, and the early church decided, which I agree with, that part of being a human means you have to have a will. Part of being a human means you have to have a will. What this means is that God the Father and God the Son have the same divine will. They have the same divine will, but because Jesus is also fully human, it also means that he has a human will as well. He has a divine will and a human will. It was not a sinful human will, but it was a human will nonetheless. And so when Jesus prays, not what I will, but what you will, what is he doing there? He is choosing to submit his human will to his Father's will. He is saying, my human will does not want to drink this cup, but I will choose to submit my human will to your divine will, Father. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 11:3, the head of Christ is God. The head of Christ is God, and Jesus submits to his head, his Father. Number two, second question, does this mean that Jesus had a choice? This is an interesting question, right? In other words, did Jesus have a choice? Could he have chosen not to die on the cross? Does he have a choice? Yes. Yes, he has a choice. The Father did not force his Son to die. He does not force him. He has a choice. Jesus willingly chooses to submit himself to the Father's will. Paul writes he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus humbles himself and says, not my will, but your will be done. We'll stop there with the exposition. Application of the text. I have 7 points of application for us. Number 1. Before he is about to be betrayed, abandoned, arrested, tried, denied, tortured, and killed, Jesus has one thing that he needs to do, and that is pray. Before he is about to be betrayed, abandoned, arrested, tried, denied, tortured, and killed, Jesus has one thing and only one thing that he needs to do, and that is pray. Jesus has less than 12 hours of his earthly life left. Less than 12 hours. In these 12 hours, a great deal is going to take place. Jesus is going to be betrayed. He's going to be abandoned. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be tried. He's going to be denied. He's going to be tortured. He's going to be killed. All this is going to take place in less than 12 hours. And so in light of this, Jesus has got something that he needs to do. There is one thing and only one thing that he must do, and it is this. He needs to pray. He needs to talk to his Father. He's not running around like a chicken with his head cut off. He's not trying to stop Judas from betraying him. He's not teaching his disciples to not abandon him. He's not pleading with Peter to not deny him. He's not running away to keep from being arrested. He's not talking to a counselor on how to deal with his grief. He's not talking to his lawyer about how to tidy up his will. He's not talking to his family and friends, giving them his last goodbyes. He is doing the one thing that he needs to do. He's talking with his Father. That's what he needs to do. Church family, don't you feel busy? Like all the time? Don't you feel busy all the time? Don't you just some days just feel overwhelmed with life? Bouncing from appointment to appointment, work meeting to work meeting, errand to errand, meetup to meetup. You're just bouncing from one thing to the next. It's just a never-ending something to do. Don't you just feel busy and overwhelmed all the time? There's just always so much to do, isn't there? There's so much to be stressed about. There's so much to be frustrated about. There's so much to worry about. But there's only one thing that we actually truly need to do. And that is pray. We need to spend time with our Father. That's the only thing that we truly need to do. In our small group, we're going through a book called A Praying Life. It's been really good so far. This past week, we read this. You don't create intimacy. You make room for it. Efficiency, multitasking, and busyness all kill intimacy. Time in prayer makes you even more dependent on God because you don't have as much time to get things done. Every minute spent in prayer is one less minute where you can be doing something productive. So the act of praying means that you have to rely more on God. You see, there were far more productive things Jesus could be doing in this moment. Productivity will kill your prayer life. Efficiency and multitasking and busyness will kill your prayer life. The best thing he could do right now is pray. You don't have time to meet with the Lord because you're so busy. You know what you should do? Meet with the Lord. Become even more busy. You know why? You'll depend on God that much more. The best thing that we can do every day is spend time with our Father. Number 2. Intense emotions can either push us to prayer or from it. Intense emotions can either push us to prayer or from it. Out of the 4 gospel writers, Mark gives us the most human side of Jesus. One of the reasons why I chose the Gospel of Mark, because we get the most human side of Jesus in the Gospel. He describes Jesus with 3 intense emotions. He describes him as greatly distressed, troubled, and very sorrowful. Luke writes that he was in agony, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground, Luke 22:44. Now, the early church, they actually wrestled with these verses, along with the verses in Luke, because they thought that it diminished Jesus' divinity. They thought that surely Jesus would, being God, he would never feel this way. Jesus, was God, and so he would go to the cross with boldness and courage, and he would have never been greatly distressed and troubled and in agony. He would have never felt this way. But we learn from the book of Hebrews that he was subject to weakness, Hebrews 5:2. We learn from the book of Hebrews that he offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears, Hebrews 5:7. Jesus not only felt emotions, he felt them intensely. He intensely felt these emotions. You know what I've learned about intense emotions? And when I say emotion, I don't, a lot of times people might think of like sadness or depressed or anxious. It could be anger too. Anger's an emotion. We watched the movie Inside Out. Like, my favorite character is Anger, because I'm like, I know that guy. You know what I learned about intense emotions? They can either push us to prayer or away from it. You get angry, and maybe we take our anger to exercise. You ever done angry exercising? You get sad, and maybe we take our sadness to food. There's a reason we call it comfort food. You get anxious, and we take our anxiety to work. You see, anxiety can function like caffeine. It fuels us. We like being anxious because it makes us more productive. It fuels us. Intense emotions can either push us to prayer or away from it. I think it can be easy to read this text and to think, these are emotions that Jesus felt while praying. And while that's true, I think there's more to it. These are not only emotions that Jesus felt while praying, these are emotions that led Jesus to praying. To praying. I think he felt these emotions first, and that led him to pray. Luke writes, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. In other words, his agony led him to pray. It pushed him, compelled him to go pray. Brothers and sisters, I want to encourage you. I want to encourage all of you. You will not find what you are looking for in the gym or in the pantry or in the cubicle. You will only find it in the closet with your Father. What you're looking for is in the closet with your Father. Let your intense emotions push you to prayer, not away from it. 3, Jesus is still giving us the same 2 commands today: abide and be alert. Jesus is still giving us the same 2 commands today: abide and be alert. Jesus gave Peter, James, and John 2 instructions. They're very simple instructions. They're just 2 words, 2 Greek words: meno and gregario. That's it. Remain, stay, abide, and watch. Stay awake, be alert. Now, there's clearly a physical component here. Jesus is telling them to physically stay there. That's true. He's telling them, like, physically stay here. Don't leave. But he's telling them to physically stay awake. That's true, right? You cannot be spiritually awake if you're not physically awake. But there's also a spiritual component here. Jesus is telling them to abide in him. He's telling them to be spiritually alert. Now, they might think, what's the big deal? Listen, Jesus, it's late at night. Like we just had a meal. It's like midnight, and man, I'm tired. Like we've been walking all day. I'm ready to go to bed. What they don't realize is that they are about to undergo the most intense trial of their lives. What they don't realize is that in a matter of like an hour or 2, they're about to undergo the most intense trial of their lives. In about an hour or so, soldiers are going to come. They're going to arrest Jesus. And the question is this: are they ready for this? Are they ready for this trial they're about to undergo? What do they need to be ready for this trial? Here's what they need: remain and watch. Abide and be alert. That's what they need. Brothers and sisters, are you ready for tomorrow's trial? Are you ready? It might be a week from now. It might be a month from now. It might be a year from now, but it's coming. God has promised trials to his people. Are you ready for the trial that you're going to face tomorrow? What do you need to prepare yourself for tomorrow's trial? The same thing the disciples need. Remain and watch. Abide and be alert. You see, when Jesus was arrested, the disciples do not abide in Jesus. What do? They abandoned Jesus. Jesus told them to remain. They needed to abide in Jesus. They abandoned Jesus. Do you know why? You know why they abandoned Jesus? Because they didn't abide before the arrest. When Peter was in the courtyard, he was not spiritually alert. Do you know why Peter was not spiritually alert in the courtyard? Because he wasn't spiritually alert before the courtyard. You see, the time to abide and be alert is not when the trial comes. Often we think, we wait till the trial comes and then we go pray. Then we go meet with God. We go to God and we say, God, I'm in this trial and I'm so stressed and I'm so anxious and I don't know how to solve this. And we go to God and we try to abide and be alert, and often we don't handle the trial well. Do you know why? Because the time to abide and be alert was before the trial. In other words, if I'm in a battle, and let's be clear, we're in a battle. If I'm in a battle, I don't want to wake up once the enemy has breached the walls. I want to be awake long before they get to the wall. I want to Stand on the wall like a watchman who sees the enemy coming, who sees the temptation and is alert and is awake and is praying and is ready for this trial. Jesus is still giving us the same two commands today. Abide and be alert. Do it before the trial comes, not when the trial comes. And yes, better late than never. 4, if Jesus prayed that the Father might change his will, so should we. If Jesus prayed that the Father might change his will, so should we. The Bible is clear that Jesus never sinned. Let's be clear about that. The Bible's very clear on this. He always did what was right. He always did what was wise. He never sinned. Everything he did was right. Everything he did was wise. And so when Jesus prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him, when he prayed, remove this cup from me, it was not sinful. This was not a sinful prayer of his. It couldn't have been. Now here's the problem. He knows that it is the Father's will for him to drink this cup. He knows that. And yet here he is asking the Father if it's possible that he doesn't have to drink it. What does that mean? It means if Jesus prayed that the Father might change his will, so should we. Now, I could preach the entire sermon on just this theme, and I have before in other sermons. I know some of you might be like squirming in your seat and be like, oh, I don't know if that's true. There are dozens and dozens of caveats and disclaimers to this that have to be said. We just do not have time for them. Here's my point, though. Here's my point. When God told Moses on the mountain, he said, Moses, therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them and that I may consume them. So God spoke. He's saying, Moses, this is my will. Leave me alone that I may consume them. That's my will. And Moses says, no, God, don't do this. Change your will. Was Moses wrong for praying that? No. When Jesus told the Canaanite woman, remember the woman comes up and says, will you heal my daughter? And Jesus tells her, I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel. He then tells her, it's not right to take the bread from the children's table and throw it to the dogs. In other words, it's not my will for me to heal you, your daughter. Please leave. Was she wrong to pray that he would just give her some crumbs? She says, well, okay, I accept that, but could I just have some crumbs? Was she wrong to pray that? No. Now let's be clear. God is not obligated to change his will for any request. Just because we ask, he's not obligated to change anything. He didn't change his will here. Jesus asked that the Father may remove this cup, and he did not change his will here. His will was for his son to drink the whole cup. But it is not wrong necessarily in and of itself to ask God to change his will. Part of God's will, listen to me when I say this, part of God's will is for us to affect his will. Part of his will is for us to affect his will in our prayers. Otherwise, what are we praying for? What are we praying for? Do not think that, it's like, well, don't slip into fatalism and be like, well, this is what God's decided. How do you know? How do you know that he doesn't want to do something different if you would pray? Don't lose heart in praying. 5. Jesus saved us from a much more terrifying reality than hell. He saved us from a holy God. Jesus saved us from a much more terrifying reality than hell. He saved us from a holy God. Was Jesus scared to die? Is that why he was feeling was he scared to die? Is the reason that he is greatly distressed and troubled and sorrowful, is it because he is terrified at the thought of being tortured? Is he terrified at the thought of having nails driven into his hands and nails driven into his feet and thorns driven into his skull? Is he terrified at the thought of being hung up to be crucified? Is that why he's feeling what he's feeling? Now listen, there may be a small piece to that. He is human after all. Let's be clear on that. He is human. There may be a small piece of that. But I don't think that is what he's primarily feeling here. He asked his Father to remove the cup because what he is greatly distressed about, what troubles him, what he is sorrowful to the point of death about, is the thought of having to drink the full cup of his Father's wrath for all of human history's sins. Jesus knows that he's going to feel the full weight of every sin ever committed. If any of you have ever walked through like very egregious sins, things that are unspeakable, you feel the weight of that. You carry that weight the rest of your life. Jesus is going to feel the weight for everything. Everything. Every unspeakable evil that's ever been committed in human history. He's going to feel all of it on the cross. He knows that he is going to drink this cup, and it's not a 20-ounce cup. It is a 20,000-year sized cup full of human depravity and all of God's wrath against it. Now, what does that mean? That means that we often think of God saving us from hell, saving us from the flames of hell. And although that's true, what makes hell hell is not the physical pain. There are people who have endured tremendous physical pain in this life. What makes hell hell is not primarily the physical pain. It is the full forsaking of God the Father. The full forsaking of him. And Jesus knows that he is about to feel this full forsaking while he hangs on the cross. He knows that for a brief time, he's going to feel the fullness of his Father's wrath, which is why he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The most terrifying thing at the judgment is not the flames of hell. The most terrifying thing is the frown of a holy God. 6. Jesus taught us to know God, not just with the respectful title of Father, but also the relational term of Abba. Jesus taught us to know God, not just with the respectful title of Father, but also the relational term of Abba. Mark is the only gospel writer who records Jesus as saying, Abba, Father. Now, as I mentioned in the exposition, this is the Aramaic term for Father. Jews did not use this to address God. It was too familiar. A term that was used in households. It was a family term. Now, Jesus had previously taught his disciples to call him Father. Our Father, who art in heaven. He told them to call God Father. But here, Jesus adds another dimension to it. He calls him Abba, Father. When Jesus uses this term, I don't think we are to see this as, well, Jesus can use that term, but we should not. I don't think that's how we should see it. We know this because listen to what the Apostle Paul writes. Romans 8:15. But you have received the Spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. Galatians 4:6. God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Martin Luther writes in his commentary on Galatians, the law scolds us, sin screams at us, death thunders at us, the devil roars at us. In the midst of the clamor, the Spirit of Christ cries in our hearts, Abba, Father. The Spirit intercedes for us, not in many words or long prayers, but with groanings, with little sounds like Abba. Have you ever noticed how the word dad in many languages is similar? Like dada, papa, baba, abba. You ever notice how many languages have a very similar sound for dad? Do you know why? Because those words come from the babbling of little children. Little kids, that's like the first sound they make. They're like baba, abba, papa, dada. It comes from the babbling of little children. One commentator writes, an everyday infant sound is applied without inhibition to God. This basic word tells us that God is not a distant ruler in transcendence, but one who is intimately close. Now, I get this, that most of us, maybe not all of us, but most of us probably don't have as intimate a relationship with our dad as we would like. And so it's difficult when we come to God. But Jesus is teaching us that, look, we are to have a respect of the King. We are to address him as our Father who art in heaven. But Jesus is also teaching us there is to be a closeness. I've shared this before. Like my sons, like when I'm in my office working on the sermon, I've got my door closed. They just come bust through and they're like, Dad, I got it. And as much as it irritates me, I am thankful that they feel comfortable to have that kind of closeness with me. I want them to feel like they can be this close. We are meant to feel this way with our Heavenly Father. To view him like a little child who has no awareness. Right? They just come up and they're like, Baba, 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 Baba. That's how we are to be with God. Seven, Jesus' submission to the Father's will is rooted in his trust of the Father's providence. Jesus' submission to the Father's will is rooted in his trust of the Father's providence. Earlier I mentioned that if Jesus prayed that the Father might change his will, so should we. And I said that there were dozens and dozens of caveats and disclaimers to this. Here's one of them. We must submit to the Father's will. Even though we pray, God, would you change or would you do this differently? We must submit to the Father's will. It is not wrong. It was not wrong for Jesus to pray, remove this cup from me. But it would have been wrong if his heart did not utter the following statement, not what I will, but what you will. You see, Jesus doesn't assume that he knows better than the Father. He doesn't assume that he has a better plan than the Father. He does not go to the Father and say, God, I've been thinking. Does it have to be crucifixion? If you're going to forgive them for anything, you don't have to, you could just forgive them, God. He doesn't come to the Father and say, I've got a better plan. He assumes that his Father has the best plan. He trusts that his Father has the best plan. I want you to see the connection between these two statements in verse 36. They bookend his prayer. Here's his prayer. Remove this cup from me. That's his prayer. Remove this cup from me. There are two bookends of that. Here's the first bookend. The first one is, all things are possible for you. The other bookend is, yet not what I will, but what you will. Now I want you to see the connection between those two bookends. What this tells me is that Jesus' submission to the Father's will is rooted in his trust of the providence of his Father. The reason he is able to submit to the Father is because he trusts that all things are possible, which means if there is any other way, If I didn't have to do this, you would find another way. But I trust that there isn't. I trust that this is the only way for you to redeem all of humanity. He trusts that. He trusts that. He says, my Father has chosen the cross, and that's the way that he's chosen, and I trust that is the way it needs to be done. You see, whenever we have trouble submitting to God's will, we all do. Whenever we have trouble submitting to God's will, here's why. It's because we believe there's another way. We believe there's a better way. Like, God, you didn't have to do this. You didn't have to make my life turn out this way, right? You could have done it differently. But when we say by faith, Lord, I believe that the choices you have made in my life, the trials, the circumstances, the personalities, the infirmities, the disabilities, the setbacks, the struggles, the disappointments, I believe that everything you have given me has been for my good and for your glory. When we can accept that, we are able to submit to him. When we can accept that, we are able to say, not as I will, but as you will. God, I trust that your plan is the best plan.